Florence, Italy. 1532. A young man walked into the Palazzo della Signoria, the seat of power. In one of the wealthiest city-states on earth, sat down on the ducal throne, and was declared the first Duke of Florence. His name was Alessandro de Medici. He was 22 years old. He commanded an army backed by the Holy Roman Emperor. He would soon marry the Emperor and Apos, own daughter. And he was black. His enemies knew it. His allies knew it. His own portraits show it. His contemporaries nicknamed him Il Moro, the Moor, and meant it as an insult. It didn't end Apos' work. Alessandro ruled Florence for 5 years, until an assassin and Apos' blade ended his life at 26. For the next 400 years, historians would debate whether he was really black, really legitimate, really significant enough to dwell on. He was all three. This is his story, and it is not the only one. To understand how a black man ended up on the throne of Florence, you have to throw away the map you were given in school. The one where Europe is on top, self-contained, and civilization flows in one direction, outward, from west to the rest. That map is wrong. Or at least, it is radically incomplete. The Mediterranean in the 15th century was not a wall between worlds. It was the busiest commercial highway on the planet, and the traffic moved in all directions. The gold that paid for Renaissance art, the gold leaf in Ghirlandaio and Apos' altarpieces, the coins in Venetian treasury vaults. A large share of it originated in the mines of the Mali Empire, and later the Songhai, in West Africa. It traveled north through trans-Saharan routes, through the Hafsid ports of Tunis and Tripoli, and into the hands of Genoese and Venetian merchants. In other words, African gold funded the Renaissance. And gold was not all that traveled. In 1402, a delegation from the Christian Empire of Ethiopia arrived in Venice. In 1441, Ethiopian monks attended the Council of Florence, meeting with the Pope and the leading theologians of Europe. In 1488, the Kingdom of Congo sent ambassadors to Lisbon and was received by the King of Portugal as a sovereign power. These were not chance encounters. They were diplomacy, conducted between parties who recognized each other, whatever private prejudices they held, as equals across a negotiating table. Europe and Africa were already in conversation before the slave trade tried to end that conversation for good. 1528. A boy arrived in Spain with no name the historical record bothered to keep. He was from West Africa. He was enslaved. He was brought into the household of a Spanish nobleman, likely to serve as a page alongside the man and Apos' own son. What no one anticipated was that he would outstudy the son. He learned Latin, then Greek. Then he started writing poetry in both. His teachers noticed. His master and Apos' family noticed. And in a decision, that tells you something about the strange, uneven textures of 16th century Spain. They let him keep going. By 1556, less than 30 years after arriving as an enslaved child, Juan Latino was appointed professor of Latin and grammar at the University of Granada. He was, as far as we know, the first person of African descent to hold a university faculty position in European history. He published 2 collections of Latin verse. He married a Spanish noblewoman named Ana de Carvalho. He was praised in print by contemporaries. A playwright named Lope de Vega later wrote a comedy, with Juan Latino as the witty, triumphant hero. Juan Latino did not live in a fair society. He lived in a society built on hierarchy of blood, religion, and origin. The same Spain that produced him was, at that very moment, expanding an Atlantic slave trade that would eventually consume millions of lives. But Juan Latino left something that slave traders could not take away: a record, books, his name on a university payroll, proof. And proof, it turns out, is very hard to erase completely. Back to Florence. Back to Alessandro. His mother and Apos' name is not recorded with certainty. What the historical record does tell us, through contemporaries who had no particular reason to lie, is that she was an enslaved woman of African origin, working in the Medici household. His father, most scholars now agree, was almost certainly Giulio da and Apos' Medici, the man who became Pope Clement VII. Think about what that means for a moment. The most powerful religious figure in the Western world almost certainly fathered a child with an enslaved black woman. And that child was raised in the Medici palace, educated alongside legitimate heirs, and eventually handed the keys to Florence. Not despite his origins. The historical record doesn't and oppose, actually support and quote, despite, and quote, it supports. This is how power worked in the Medici family, and Alessandro was inside it. His enemies hated him for it. Not because he was incompetent. By the accounts of those who worked with him, he was a capable and decisive ruler. They hated him because his existence complicated the stories they wanted to tell about blood and legitimacy, and who deserved to rule. Il Moro, they called him. The Moor. Alessandro and Appo's portraits survive. At least two, attributed to Pontormo and Vasari. Art historians who have examined them describe a man whose features, the shape of the nose, the fullness of the lips, the curl of the hair, are consistent with partial sub-Saharan African ancestry. For 2 centuries, those same features were explained away. Southern Italian complexion, artistic convention, the light in Tuscan studios. The simplest explanation that his contemporaries were telling. The truth when they described him as Moorish was the one that kept getting set aside. Recent scholarship has stopped setting it aside. Alessandro de Medici was black. He was the first Duke of Florence. He was 22 years old when he took that throne. He was 26 when Lorenzino de Medici stabbed him in the dark, and then fled to Venice. Lorenzino called it tyrannicide, a blow for Republican freedom. Historians have been skeptical ever since. The timing, the motive, the flight, it reads less like political idealism and more like a cousin who wanted what Alessandro had. He was not a footnote. He was the story. Here is a question worth sitting with. If these men existed, if the records survived, if the portraits are still hanging in museums, why Don and Appo's team most people know their names? The answer is not a single conspiracy. It is something more ordinary and more insidious than that. It is selective attention. The choice, made generation after generation, by the people who wrote history books about what was significant, enough to dwell on. That choice was not made in a vacuum. It was made during the same centuries that the transatlantic slave trade grew from a regional practice into an industrial system that would forcibly move more than 12 million people across an ocean. To sustain that system economically, you needed labor. To sustain it morally, or to quiet the part of your conscience that asked uncomfortable questions, you needed a story. A story that said the people being enslaved were suited for it, that they had no history worth telling, no kingdoms worth acknowledging, no scholars, no dukes, no professors. That story required editing the existing record, not always through dramatic forgery, mostly through something quieter. A historian who describes Alessandro and Appo's complexion as in quote, swarthy in quote, and moves on. A textbook that covers the Medici in 12 pages and gives Alessandro 2 sentences. A museum label that calls a portrait, end quote, sitter unknown, end quote, when the evidence is sitting right there. The scholars recovering this history now, historians like Kate Lowe, at the University of London, who edited the landmark academic volume on Black Africans in Renaissance Europe, are not discovering a hidden conspiracy. They are doing something almost more radical. They are simply reading the documents that were already there and refusing to explain them away. One more man, one more story, because the history does not end with the Renaissance. Around 1696, a boy from Central Africa, scholars believe from the region near Lake Chad, was brought to Constantinople as part of the slave trade. From there, he was sent as a diplomatic gift to Tsar Peter the Great of Russia. His name in Russia became Abram Petrovich Ganable. Peter was genuinely fascinated by the boy and did something almost no one in his position did. He took his education seriously. Ganable was formally schooled, baptized with Peter as his godfather, and sent to France to study military engineering and fortification. He served in the French army. He returned to Russia, rose through the ranks, and eventually achieved the title of General-in-Chief, the highest military grade below the royal family itself. He owned estates. He held a noble title. He had children who married into Russian aristocracy. His great-grandson was Alexander Pushkin, the man Russians call the father of their literary language. Pushkin knew his great-grandfather Andropov's story. He was proud of it. He started writing a biographical novel about Gannibal, which he never finished, because Pushkin died at 37 in a duel, which is a whole other story, but in the fragments that survive, he described his ancestor as a man who earned the Tsar Andropov's esteem through his own talent. There is a direct line from an enslaved boy in Constantinople to the man who invented modern Russian literature. That line runs through a black general. His name was Abram Gannibal, and he was real. That portrait of Alessandro de Medici is hanging in a museum. Right now, people walk past it every day. Most of them probably Don Andropos. T know who he was. The label might not say, or it might say it in a way that doesn't Andropos. T quite add up to the truth. He was the first Duke of Florence. He was black. He was 22 years old when he took the throne of one of the most powerful city-states in the world. Juan Latino published 2 books of Latin poetry and taught at the University of Granada for decades. Abram Gannibal rose from slavery to become a Russian general, and his bloodline produced Pushkin. Ethiopian monks prayed in Rome in the shadow of St. Peter and Apos' Basilica for 100 years before the Sistine Chapel ceiling was painted. These are not feel-good exceptions designed to balance a grim ledger. They are not proof that the past was secretly just. The past was not just. Slavery was real. Colonialism was real. The ideology that justified both of those things was real, and it did enormous damage to the historical record, not through one dramatic conspiracy, but through 2 centuries of quiet choices about what was worth remembering. What is also real, these men were there. Their names are in the documents. Their faces are in the paintings. History is not what happened. History is what we decide to look at. It is time to look.